This presentation is based on a publication that Becky and I were authors on, as well as our former colleague, Barb Haynes, who worked with us in University of Minnesota Extension, as well as across state with University of Wisconsin Extension service as well. And so we updated this publication. I think, what was our original publication date, Becky? I'm trying to remember. We just recently updated again, wanted to make sure we had it up to date before Becky retired. And so we were involved in doing, not only publishing this, this document, but also doing some presentations around that. I want to say around 2016, somewhere around that area. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And our goals then for today are to increase knowledge and understanding. Whoops, I'm sorry, I guess I skipped ahead here. There we go. Increase knowledge and understanding of generations, enhance comprehension of how generational differences affect communication patterns, and specifically related to financial education, and then also promote skills for effective intergenerational communication around financial education. So we want to take a look, first of all, at what makes a generation. Generally, it's considered about 20 years. That has kind of decreased a little bit over the time span with changes in technology as things have kind of sped up in society. There are generally happenings that occur during formative years that affect our attitudes, our values, our perceptions. And the core values of the large group, the cohort, really are affected as well. Some things that you might recognize that would affect the development of a generation would be things like the Great Depression. We also saw some influences related to the Great Recession. You will also see now there's quite a bit of discussion going on around COVID-19 and whether there will be the establishment of a new generation during this time frame, because these are global events that have occurred. So how they affect us in the US might be one thing, but there are effects across the world as well. And so we see that in generations, there are usually global effects. Okay, and Becky's going to take us through the generations and talk a little bit about what each generation characteristics are.
Thank you, Lori. And as you can see, the list that we decided to cover, and Lori, I did find the date on our previous publication, I think was 2014, updated. Okay. So we, as was mentioned, felt it was time to bring this out again. It's such an interesting area, and I find anyway, very worthwhile in just thinking of generalities that might exist, knowing there are many exceptions. For example, I listened to a speaker in regard to her personal generation, which I believe was a millennial, and she shared she was raised by her grandparents, and actually she felt inclined to correlate some of her beliefs with her grandparents. So I found that very interesting as well. So I just want to say that up front, there are many exceptions depending on your, like Lori mentioned, where you're from, personal, peace, etc. So keep that in mind as we walk through the generations. Okay, the first one that we'll take a look at is the depressions, or the GI. And if you take a look at 1901 to 1926, so we're talking 125 on one end and 95 on the other. And just a note that there are many articles that talk about trivia information about living to 100, being a centurion, and that more people than ever today are. It's increased, but certainly there are many factors that might be a part of their lifespan. But some of the characteristics that were found was the uniformity. So looking at agreeing, perhaps having similar goals, routines were found by some, and a note of humor. I found an article on non-research based, but I found interesting trivia in regard to routine, looking at just finding those things that might create comfort, a habit that might be important to that individual to have in their life for kind of security. And the note of humor is one individual that was aged 106 liked ice cream every day, as an example, and bacon. And of course, not research-based, but if you think of habits and routines and good agreement, sometimes it's with their life choice. Cooperativeness, looking at importance of government, being political in the sense of pride for country. Winners and achievers, this is a hardworking group. One article called them robust because they're hard workers, diligent, and leaders. And often they would choose community or society in general gain over personal gain. So it's something to think of. Again, many exceptions perhaps, but an interesting age group. And also, I just wanted to mention that they lived through quite a few things. Depression, World War II. They were children during World War I and the Roaring 20s. So if you think of what they experienced, and that's one thing we tried to get across in our publication, life experiences that could mold the characteristics as well.
Interesting to think about too, when there have been books written around the greatest generation. This is that group.
Yeah, yeah. And just a note of trivia again, the oldest living person was 122 from France, and she passed away in 1997. And currently the oldest individual living is 118 in Japan. So again, there's so many articles, and it's just very interesting, kind of a interest in centurions and what is it, what traits that might help one live longer. Okay. Okay, the silence, and this would be the 1927 to 1948. So we're talking about individuals that are 94 to 76, and looking at those that in general, some of the traits would be ones that are ambitious, that they might seek achievement, again, hard workers, might be a little freer in spending money, work ethic, looking at respect for authority. So looking at, again, kind of following the rules and the kind of syndrome. Delayed reward. I think of this with my mother-in-law. She used to talk about how many hours she had to work to buy a new pair of tennis shoes, for example. They were very, in general, spending more, but still those on the far end, frugal, perhaps. Delayed reward. You might hear of someone saving to buy a new refrigerator if it wasn't a dramatic need at the time, where there was that delayed reward goal, perhaps. Loyalty in numerous ways, and desire to be youthful and vital. And just looking at some of the advertisements through time, you could probably note some of the products and ads that you could remember even that may no longer exist, but that youthful trend for the public, for example. Okay, then we have characteristics of boomers, and I fall in that category. But looking at creative working, perhaps reaching dreams, and again, more independence, perhaps. Teamwork, they love to work in groups and talk and plan and all of that. Group setting is very comfortable for boomers in general. Personal gratification, focus on health and wellness. If you take a look at a lot of the articles that are out geared towards boomers in magazines, for example, it's often with a health and wellness focus as well. They love to talk, and we mentioned a clue on that with teamwork, but talking, you get a group of boomers together and you might hear a lot of chatter in a room. Not, again, there are exceptions, but in general. And workaholic. Long hours perhaps to finish a project was one example, and work was very important. Okay, then we have characteristics of Gen X. And if we take a look at that, that was 56 to 41 on the other end. But taking a look at more self-reliance, perhaps than some of the other generations, appreciate and expect feedback. And I remember hearing one individual that in her new employment role, that was something she just really craved, was that feedback. And it just resonated that that could be an example. They're adaptable and informal. Technology is a big key here, very adept. Although this is interesting because we can't stereotype either, and we mentioned it's with exceptions, but more of the older generation individuals are very tech savvy today. So we can't generalize as such. But they are with a special interest, I think, as well. May lack interpersonal skills. Again, it depends. And relevance is often sought to complete tasks. They want to know why. Anyone ever know anyone that would ask why? Always bringing it back to purpose or relevance. Okay, then we have the millennials, and that gets into the 40 to 25 brackets in 1981 to 1994. And they're known as being social, multitasking. They can do many things at once. Love active learning, often motivated by money and earning potential and looking at employment opportunities and such, perhaps. Very goal-oriented. And here again, technology, a lot of experience with technology. And then we have characteristics of Generation Z or at, and that's the 1997 actually to 2010. And so we're looking at individuals aged 24 to 11. I have a niece that's in this category. So it's kind of fun to think of in relation to her life. But with this, looking at opportunities with careers, family educated, communication, active consumers, looking at even influence over parents, how they spend money, often more highly indulged potential, strong work ethic, and social consciousness. And then we have characteristics of Generation Alpha, which is the 10 into current times. So if we think of that, it's kind of exciting. As Lori mentioned, we don't know what the next generation will be named, but taking a look at tremendous career opportunities. So perhaps many openings and acquisition of positions, employment positions. They're the most formally educated. There may be a need to keep up identified strongly. May become economically savvy in contrast to parents, and influenced by global economic crisis. And as was mentioned, the COVID-19 impact and what that will result in perhaps with naming the next generation.
All right. So right now we want you to think about how we communicate. Think about the generation that you are a part of and how we communicate in that generation maybe differently than other generations. Consider how those generational differences affect our communication and family interaction across our generations, and how those components impact our financial communication and practice. So if you are willing to share in the chat, we'd love to have you share your thoughts. Again, the generational differences and how they affect our communication and family interactions across generations, and what impacts that means for our financial communication and practice. I'm sorry if my cursor's been jumping ahead a little bit. I have to actually take it off of the slide in order to make sure it's not jumping ahead of us. It wants to do that all on its own. So what do you think? How does our generation, each of us, differently impact how we communicate and then eventually our financial communication and practice? Okay, Lisa says that she's a checkbook girl. The 22-year-old daughter then does electronic banking and debit card, everything online, and you prefer it all on paper. Yeah, that's something that we've encountered. We'll talk a little bit about that too as we kind of go back to how we started working on this publication and the differences that we were seeing as well in how people manage. And very often we find that youth that we've worked with are entirely online, and they'll maybe check their accounts online, but that doesn't mean that something hasn't crossed, in the meantime, that they're not seeing that may have changed their account balances and things like that. And so tracking is still a very important task. Melissa, whoops, I missed this as well. Looks like we had another one here. Melissa says, as a marketer for a credit union, I don't necessarily send out different communication for different generations, but it's something we're looking at to help get the attention and help educate younger people. Yeah, I think it's, you probably don't say it outwardly, but you just think about it a little bit differently as you're doing these things. I think this is Allison. I think Gen Z and Alpha will be getting rid of the stigma of talking about finances. Okay. That's something that is very different. When I was growing up, most people that I knew did not talk about finances. In my family, we did. My mom was a bookkeeper. And so that was just kind of what she was used to doing. And so it wasn't odd in our family to do that. But I found out later that other people didn't talk about those things. Natalie, I have always been very open when it comes to talking about finance. That is not what was taught to me when I was growing up. And okay, a baby boomer also. Yeah, the same for me, Natalie. Yeah. All right. Others, thoughts about this? It's interesting to hear people's thoughts, about how we communicate differently. And okay, Kamat says same for me. And who else added something here? Okay, Nancy, my 20-something sons are very active in the stock market, personally investigating and tracking. And yeah, that's really interesting. And you hear more and more about younger people with cryptocurrency. I've yet to learn a whole lot about that. I've attended a few trainings around that, and I'm still kind of, I don't know that I would be doing that myself, but the younger people may be getting into some of those. Okay, and they're into cryptocurrency, she says as well. Yeah, I keep hearing it should be part of a portfolio, and I'm not there yet for sure. Michelle, Gen X and learn to save for what I want. Okay. Lisa, retirement and savings doesn't seem to matter to younger people, but if they start now, they would be set. Yeah. And don't say retirement to them, but getting rich later. Yeah, they may not be wanting to think about retirement, but it's just an overall financial security as we age. And they're probably not willing to think about those things quite yet. Okay. Interesting comments from everyone. Thank you so much. So we wanted to share a little bit about the rationale for why we developed the publication. And over the years, and Becky and I were just talking before we started the webinar that, you know, if we thought back to when we were really doing some of this work, back in 2005, 2006, our Youth and Money team was working with college students, and we were beginning to identify how that generation at that time was different from others and how they learned differently than others. We were doing a study around providing financial education through podcasts and whether that was acceptable for students, because they were listening to, you know, we had the little iPods and people were walking around hooked into them and listening to podcasts. And that was something that people were picking up on pretty quickly at that point. So we were looking at the way to adapt financial education to meet the needs. And we were really realizing that all generations bring something different to their financial management experiences. As we began to look at the generations differently in financial education, one publication came to mind, something that I remember using in college, and it was the 1982 publication, Financial Management Throughout Your Life. It was Dottie Goss from the University of Minnesota, and it really looked at financial life cycle tasks. And if we think about it today, the tasks may not be necessarily life cycle tasks. We find that maybe there are some tasks that are bridging across a variety of generations. And so we were looking as educators at the types of activities also that we were using for various audiences, and began to address whether they were appropriate, not only based on the financial activities that we were seeing, but also the generational perspective. And so that kind of led us to our publication. As we look at what those lifestyle tasks were that we were identifying from not only the Goss publication, but we saw in other literature as well, building the foundation, early accumulation, rapid accumulation, financial independence, conservation, distribution, and sunset. And so, you know, as we were looking at these life cycle tasks, we were asking ourselves, how can we address these stages appropriately for each generation that's potentially involved in that stage? And what we were finding is that very often, even though these were life cycle tasks, some of them may have been delayed, and so other generations might be involved other than the one that it was in maybe that particular, what we would consider a life cycle stage. For example, for many millennials, we found that things like home purchases and starting a family might have been delayed because many of them had dealt with student debt. And that was part of our education. And so, you know, we really couldn't be talking to them about thinking about purchasing a home or starting a family because they weren't really quite there yet. Even though that, if we looked at just life cycle, you might have assumed that that would be where they would be at. All right. And so then the benefits of teaching generationally, we know and recognize that financial tasks are different at each stage of life, and that each generation might handle these differently based on their experience during their developmental years. And so let's just take a look at a couple of examples. Myself, I'm pretty careful about my private information, and knowing that, you know, being out on the internet can influence those things. I also know that I shouldn't carry my social security card with me, right? Because there's a potential of identity theft if someone were to get a hold of that. In my mom's generation, though, social security cards, and she's in the silent generation, social security cards are a method of identification. And so for years, you know, things like your insurance number and things like that were identified with your social security card. And so she still thinks it's an appropriate thing to carry a social security card with you. And so to recognize that, you know, I can't yell at her about doing that, but I also have to explain what the reasoning is why you don't want to have it available to people in case her purse were stolen or something on that order, because it is a means of identifying her and could be used in identity theft. We had the example earlier about the debit cards. I'm someone who writes checks as well as uses my debit card, uses electronic methods. But, you know, some young people today are just entirely online using their electronic payments and debit cards. And there may be an appropriate place for a check to be written and to explain why that might be the case, or how there are different methods of payments that we would want to use. And so again, this is something that generationally has changed, and we want people to understand if, you know, if someone were to use a check, why you might use a check, and how do you track that then? There is still a need for tracking some of these items, even though we may be dealing almost entirely online with some of our accounts. All right, Becky.
Okay, and Lori, just one thing to add to that, it just made me think. Another colleague and I did a lot of education on the Fond du Lac Indian Reservation, and we had programs that blended the elders with youth, community members in financial education, and the sharing, the wisdom that was present. It was unbelievably awesome to use that word. Just the sharing and the respect for what their elders had gone through in their lives and how they really framed the knowledge in chunks of information that the youth really resonated with. And so I wanted to bring that up too, that sometimes that blending, and in that case, it was specific with that group, but it was amazing what was shared. And then we were in the schools and we could see the wisdom from their grandparents, the youth's grandparents, that they shared in class. And actually through legends, Jennifer Garbo, one of my colleagues, and I were involved with using legends to teach financial education. And it was amazing. It was very exciting work. Anyway, going on, teaching strategies for all generations.
I'll just add one other thing too. That's a really important point. And I think as we go on, we'll look at we sent out the publication to everyone so that you have an opportunity to look at that as well. And we do have some of those, you know, the cross generational or intergenerational kinds of experiences that we talked about too. Just wanted to mention also that we have Glenda in the chat said that her 35 and 40-year-old children have both focused on retirement savings as they plan to have freedom earlier than both Glenda and her husband, and they're boomers. And so the children are now looking at, changing their financial situations so that they do have the possibility of freedom later. So yeah, generations will deal differently, and it may be based on what they saw in their family. It may also be just the generation and what, you know, a lot of people saw as we went through the Great Recession, thinking about people losing money and not being able to retire when they thought they would be able to, and things like that too. So.
Yeah, good point. Right. Looking at teaching strategies for all generations, one point that's often recommended is in regard to time for activities, to make sure you have plenty of it. And of course, we all know knowing your group and type of learners that you're working with, there are priorities and preferences as well. Also, to allow time and opportunity for both group and individual responses. So those individuals that might feel more comfortable in a group have that opportunity, and individuals, some people prefer working alone, for an example. Also, provide opportunities to share experiences. And the interesting part of this is to build in an opportunity to pass or to opt out if so desired. And working with some of the groups that we did, we always provided that opportunity. And it was always interesting to see those that selected whatever choice they felt comfortable with. So an opportunity to pass. Also, looking at varied activities, having those different opportunities that would be part of the overall teaching plan. And one example would be if we look back to the silence, some of them, again, very unique per individual, but some may not choose to talk in a large group setting. They might be more internal with their sharing. So to have that variety is very important. And opportunities do vary extremely. I remember early teaching years, I had a female student in 7th grade who just for some reason, because of a bus experience, decided she was not going to talk, period. And so she sat in her classes, did not share. And I was able to get her to talk later. I have a very good relationship, very sweet individual. But for most of her classes, she sat there and did not talk because of, I believe, a bullying situation on the bus. And she was a very shy individual, and she was a 7th grader. So there again, to know individuals and their stories, and to be aware of their comfort levels.
But I think too, you bring out a good point, like with the silent generation, not maybe wanting to share. One of the important characteristics there is the idea of not challenging authority. And, you know, so if you are a person that grew up not challenging authority and you have a differing opinion of the instructor, you probably aren't going to say that out loud, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, there again, going back to some of those characteristics that could be able to explain what's happening. Okay, then looking at activities, and again, variety is key for all of us, right? We like variety mostly with learning. And so to think of that and specific activities that can be changed. Technology might be presented in different ways. For example, pairing up a learner, adapted technology with those that are learning, and different games or techniques with technology choices. Also, to utilize puzzles and games and different activities. One thing we found working with the youth in the reservation there, they love puzzles. So
we lost voice.
oh, am I muted? Oh, sorry about that. But activities, looking at how we can vary it, technology teams pairing, but the puzzles I mentioned, that group loved puzzles, and we would take Ojibwe vocabulary words and make puzzles and then put them out on the tables, and it was a way for students to informally interact and figure it out, and it was fun to watch. Role playing, I know Lori and I've always had discussion on this one with that. It must be my mature boomer activity that I love it, but not for some reason I don't warm up to role playing, and that's my just person, probably more of a listener in some settings as an example. And we're all uniquely different in how we learn. So being aware of that and for example, not making everyone role play if they choose not to, as an example. And being flexible and opting out. Again, if someone, when I just had to laugh, younger years, they asked people to play out some part. Boy, you'd see me industriously writing as not to have eye contact, for example. I did get more out of that.
That actually is something that boomers, that's not necessarily something that we all want to be involved in. I know it's more personal, but a team activity related to, if you're doing it in a small group for a boomer, that's probably more appropriate because the team activity is where boomers are at.
Right.
The better solution is probably if you ask for people to volunteer and come and do that in front of the group, because then you get the people that are real extroverts and willing to do those things and not afraid to do them.
Absolutely.
And it might work across generations too. If you've got like younger people working with older folks too, you might find that there are some differences in how they'll approach those things. So getting
absolutely
them cross
many variables actually that could exist on that, but the key to understand comfort levels, so being sensitive to learning styles and aware of group characteristics. They might have some unique preferences that come forward in learning. And one example with technology, the breakout rooms, it's so interesting. That came up in a conversation where here we're all on technology, Zoom or whatever it means, and yet more than not, they're often breakout rooms, and nothing against them, but it was interesting to get feedback where all of a sudden it was so predictable. I think that's what it was with some learners. It was like, okay, they had their content, and then all of a sudden there were breakout rooms, and the learners were reacting to maybe, how did one phrase it, the hesitancy of sharing in a group where they didn't know anyone online. I found that interesting when we think of other means of activities. So again, preferences and what's comfortable in learning. Okay, then at this time, we'd like you to think about how you might utilize this information. And I know that some of you did respond in the email that was sent out in regard to that. But if you would take a moment, and if anyone had any new thoughts or any that you'd like to share, please type in the chat. Just a thought on how you might utilize this generational information.
And as people are waiting to do that, again, the publication, we've got, you probably can't see it because I'm on blur here, but so the publication does kind of give that grid of looking at each of the generations, their characteristics, their lifestyles, some potential concerns and problems that they would have related to financial situations, and some relative financial concepts, and then potential teaching techniques and activities to teach those concepts. So we wanted to share those with you so you can consider what you might be able to use in your specific situation.
And they do have the link, right, Lori, to this?
Yeah, we sent that out yesterday with the reminder email. So everyone should have a copy of that.
Okay, anything new in the chat here? Lori, maybe you can help me take a look at the most.
Yeah, okay, so we have Maria says, when meeting with diverse clients, better understanding of how to communicate with them in terms of financial dialogue. Lisa, it's good to know how each generation learns or likes to receive information. I teach audiences of all ages, so this is helpful. So
yeah, thank you.
And even talking about, relevant concepts when we're talking about a checkbook versus working online. If I talk about managing a bank account online, my mom's going to just go blank. She doesn't want to deal with that. So we have to recognize that everyone's different in how they're approaching things. Nancy says, as a teacher, I'm always thinking of how to differentiate learning for my students. This is one more tool to take into consideration. And Glenise then shares, with Learning Circle leaders and members who are mostly from silent and baby boomer generations, help them understand some of their children and grandchildren's view of financial decisions and strategies. Yeah, because it really has changed in how people are managing and how they're thinking about. Kamat says it will support me as a baby boomer to help support financial growth and management from family from multiple generations.
Right. And looking at a list of what was submitted for that questionnaire, I know looking at individuals indicated personally for my parents and professional with multi-generational families to support those I have contact with, better teaching of financial courses, working with youth and families and helping strategies for financial success, and with clients, educating community members, consideration of audience program planning, and for my role as a financial educator. And this last one also to identify with future participants. So as we think of the new generation for the future, that will be very interesting as well. So thank you for all your comments and thoughts on this.
Yeah, Natalie just added, as new students come into our school as years go on, important to know the characteristics of future generations that we come in contact with and how to best teach and communicate with them. So yeah, and recognizing that, they are different and some of the things that we do. And it's interesting to think about how this COVID-19 pandemic might influence a new generation beginning, because how we're managing things may be very different now in comparison to, even just 2 years ago. We're seeing some differences even in things like how we, what we're ordering online and having delivered to homes, things like that. So we certainly have been influenced by all of this, and it has been global. So it'll be interesting to see if a new generation does emerge from this. Other thoughts, comments? Becky, anything else you want to?
Well, the next slide I think is on stories. Is that correct?
No, it's about just engaging with us, I do believe. Oh, okay. No, it's
there. That's what I was saying about. I love stories, so I was just thinking of that. And I mentioned our work with American Indian students at Fond du Lac Reservation School a bit. If anyone's interested in that, let me know. We did do a legends book, Jennifer Garbo and I, on educational sessions with legends in mind. But also, Lori and I have a history of working with home study group members, and it often brings forward some of the early generations, right, Lori? And what we learned. I still remember when I first started Extension and hearing stories about living through the Depression. One woman said back then they could only have butter or peanut butter. They couldn't have both, as an example, on their bread. And so hearing the stories and what people experienced is key in understanding the generation. Lori, any comments on that? I know we've talked a lot.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, when you take a look at the Depression era versus the silence, and the silence being a little bit more freer spending, that makes sense because they lived through the Depression. And then as a result, if I have money, I'm going to spend it, I may do it carefully, but I'm going to spend on what I want to spend on based on the fact that tomorrow we could be without, so that makes sense in that context. You will also find that, people from Depression era, even silence, are very resourceful people, saving a number of things, and I remember this very clearly from my grandmother's, ages and thinking about, the plastic bags, the bread bags that went inside the boots to keep your feet dry. You save everything in order to make sure that you have what you need. And so very resourceful in some of these generations as well. And so it's interesting to think back to some of those comments and experiences.
Yeah, and if anyone has any story that they are, burning desire to share, we'd appreciate it. But I know, at least for you to think of stories related to your cross-generational work. It's fascinating, how people make decisions, what influences those decisions. And the publication back paragraph I'll just share, each generation has been shaped by their experiences during their early years. Those experiences in some way vary in each generation and provide a filter for decisions that each of us makes. Shared knowledge across generations increases the capacity of all to expand their financial knowledge and behaviors. So you'll probably going away thinking of stories that fall into all of this because they're there within our families, our friends, those we work with. We're always learning about how to reach different individual learners. Anything else, Lori?
I think that's a good way to summarize things, and I appreciate that. That's just a good ending point for us. I think we also want to certainly continue to type in the chat if you would share other items. We're happy to make sure that we recognize those comments, but we want to share our resources. They're also on the back of the publication, as you'll see. And we want to make sure to let you know that we are all over talking about generational differences. All of the social media things, we are all over social media. We are on Facebook, both with English and Spanish Facebook sites, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, and YouTube. So be sure to look for us and engage with us on those social media sites. There's our contact information, and we're happy to engage with you individually as well. So if that's more of your interest, we're happy to do that as well.